Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with this cute pupper from Siberia. As cute as it is, this pup has been dead for 18,000 years and is incredibly well preserved. Beyond simply being an incredibly old corpse, the body itself is interesting. Scientists can give a rough estimate of its age. They can also identify what sex it is. What they aren't so sure is whether or not it is a wolf or a dog. It is a grey area between the two. Examining the genetic information contained within would allow us to begin identifying when, and to some degree how, dogs began to diverge from wolves and become domesticated. In other gruesome animal-related news, mummified lion cubs have been found in one of Egypt's tombs. They were among a much larger selection of other animals that had been mummified. These and the other remains date back to the 26th dynasty, which is somewhere in the 7th century BCE. In less depressing news, a small worm could be providing an avenue of investigation for the next generation of antibiotics. The media makes a rather large point of the superbugs that go around in hospitals, things like the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. They are increasingly resistant to just about all the antibiotics currently available, with few options left that still have effect, but are also incredibly toxic. For this reason, researchers are looking to other ways of developing antibiotics. And in this case, one particular compound was discovered in the digestive tract of nematodes. Nematodes are a form of parasitic worm that, over time, will develop a population in most soils and waters, and eventually take up residence inside a living organism. Most antibiotic-resistant bacteria will be gram-negative. This means they don't have a large cell wall made up of a compound called peptidoglycan. This means the usual antibiotics that would target that particular compound do not work very well, if at all. Since this doesn't allow for easy targeting of the bacteria, we have limited antibiotics available. This is why gram-negative bacteria are particularly prone to becoming medication resistant, but also are more difficult to find antibiotics to use. The new antibiotic is called darobactin, and it binds to a protein and prevents it from functioning correctly. This causes the cell wall to fail to develop correctly, leading to cell death. Speaking of evolution and evolutionary pressures, the conversation has an interesting article on how there were effectively 9 species of human, but now there is just one. They explain how this both began and ends with us as the sole species, Homo sapien. The process of producing only a single, ultimately successful species throws more than a few spanners into the works of the image put forward of a peaceful, noble hunter-gatherer species that is often the basis for things like a keto diet. Instead, it appears to paint a picture of not only a primitive, but also very violent, if not extremely violent, species. A rather disconcerting statistic they put forward is that per a population, the casualty rates for men in these sorts of primitive wars were higher than what would be seen in World War I and World War II, which effectively crippled countries for decades after they occurred. This explains that why, within a few thousand years, Neanderthals had been completely supplanted by Homo sapiens. The evidence that supports a close association with encountering Homo sapiens is that we share distinct, DNA traces from these species. Not only from those species, but only within those races now that seem to find origins in the same areas as these other human species. Examples of this are the East Asian and Polynesians sharing DNA with the Denisovians. People in Europe share a lot more DNA with Neanderthals. The article from the conversation puts this in the context of not only where we've come from, but how people are looking forward and hoping that we might find life on other planets, and puts it in a rather harsh light, if not one that is necessarily inaccurate. Going back to animal-related news, a German man has died after contracting a rare infection from his dog. The case study of a 63-year-old German man covers how he allowed his dog to lick him, leading to infection and ultimately his death. The man presented at a Red Cross hospital in Bremen after 3 days of symptoms. He initially thought it was flu, and then it became worse, and eventually he went to the hospital. While there, he was experiencing nerve and muscle pain. He also had subcutaneous bleeding on his legs. In addition to all of this, which was bad enough, he had kidney injury, liver dysfunction, and hypoxia. The obvious culprit of meningitis didn't match with any of his other symptoms, nor could he have a tropical or rare disease since he hadn't travelled. This left just one real option: sepsis. In an attempt to control the sepsis, he was treated with a series of antibiotics given in conjunction. This would normally be used for medication-resistant bacteria, but he continued to decline and then experienced cardiac arrest. After resuscitation, he was put on a respirator. On the 4th day in hospital, doctors finally identified what was causing his condition, and it was a bacteria called Capnocytophaga canimorsus. Not a particularly rare infection, but what is important is that it is primarily found in the mouths of cats and dogs, and is only transmitted to humans on a rare basis, primarily when people are bitten. In this case, the man hadn't been bitten or anything else. He'd simply been licked by his dog. This rather benign action was ultimately what led to his death 16 days after admission. This is not all that surprising when you consider there is a 25% fatality rate within the literature. In other, slightly less and more alarming news, Dr. He of the CRISPR baby infamy is still missing 1 year after his mysterious disappearance. Not just Dr. He seems to have disappeared, but even the babies who were the leading evidence of the success of his work have also not been heard from. The family in general has gone dark. Based on China's history of not only human rights abuses, but its propensity towards overreacting, there is a good chance that we may not hear from Dr. He at all, and all efforts to track his movements after his presentation of findings at a conference has revealed very little that was not already known. In another annual update, coming up to 1 year since the mysterious vaping illness in America became well known, over 2,200 people have become sick. Health officials put this number at roughly 2,290, with 47 dying. In one of the God Emperor Trump's better decisions, he will be hosting a meeting on vaping at the White House, where a range of groups will discuss industry and public health action that can be taken to curtail the use of nicotine and cannabis-containing products by both children and adults. In another interesting article coming out of the conversation, the authors heavily criticize the gay gene testing apps, not only because they could be wrong, but dangerous. These gene testing apps work on the basis of associating particular genes with outcomes based on the literature. Fundamentally, that's not necessarily wrong. What it fails to do is put these in context, and therein lies the danger. These apps generally attribute any findings from particular studies as being more or less the sole accurate representation of that gene's function. That isn't always what happens. Even if it is a genetically caused predisposition, it doesn't mean it will necessarily play out that way, and there could be multiple genes influencing the outcome. This means that finding one gene known to be associated with a specific outcome does in no way assure that that will be the outcome. This is why apps like How Gay Are You are fundamentally flawed, and any sexual practices, orientation, or even expression cannot solely be associated with those genes. The authors go on to explain that trying to posit this particular argument fundamentally undermines the nature of how humans exist and how sexuality comes to be and is expressed. The Conversations article summarizes it very well with this particular statement. These apps are marketed as a curiosity or as harmless fun, but there is danger in claiming to be able to use genetics to predict any aspect of someone's identity, abilities, mental health, or sexual orientation. Misunderstanding of genetic information can have grave consequences for those receiving it. That quote perfectly summarizes how some of these apps are more or less pseudoscience that tries to take established, real science and research and apply it in completely inappropriate ways to produce money for themselves, but no benefit for those who are purchasing the goods, and in some cases prospectively harm. It is like making future decisions about yourself based on a magic 8-ball. In other genetics-related news, a number of authors are taking aim at the various DNA test startups and fundamentally attribute them with one label that they really don't want to have, that of being a scam. This is not companies like Ancestry or 23andMe. Rather, these are other companies which claim to provide a far more detailed breakdown. They purport to be able to provide you with an idea of your personality traits, medical conditions, and mental illnesses. As has just been touched on with the How Gay Are You apps, these are not intrinsically solely genetically caused attributes. They are a product of a complex picture that pure genetic testing cannot account for. But these sorts of personality traits are not the most egregious of claims made. Some think that they can tell you what sort of exercise regime to use to achieve proficiency within a particular sport, others as to what your diet should subsist of, and what wine you should drink. The Futurism article aptly describes this as modern horoscopes, where you may find that in broad terms the descriptions are relevant to you, but nothing is specific, despite having provided them with very specific information in the form of genomic code. It seems that at least some of the startups are beginning to see that this may be a liability for them, and are increasingly providing information that, if nothing else, indicates that what they are telling customers may not be relevant, accurate, or even correct. Now for an interesting, albeit rather weakly evidenced, study into how you should not remove water from your ears. Researchers from Cornell University have created 3D printed models of ears and ear canals. They were trying to figure out how much force would be needed to remove the water from them. They found that it is somewhere around 10 times the force of gravity, which, especially for infants, is enough to cause brain damage. Now, they admit quite readily that these are very preliminary findings based on entirely lab-based tests, and that there is nothing clinically relevant to them at this stage. Going now from the medically and physiologically relevant, we look at a metal that conducts electricity but not heat. If you have ever looked into technology, and particularly central processor units or CPUs of computers, you will find that both the total power consumption and heat output tend to be closely associated. CPUs and similar are built out of conductors. Conductors allow power to flow through and different changes to be registered. The more densely you pack these conductors in, the more productivity you get out of a processor. In the case of current technology, it's generally accepted that for the average consumer, 7 nanometers is the smallest gap you will get. This produces a lot of heat, and still draws quite a bit of power. In theory, you could bring them even closer together. If it would not affect the function, the heat would not be as extreme, but total power draw could increase. This is where this new interesting metal comes in. A metal identified in 2017 called vanadium dioxide is well known for a number of attributes, particularly that it is a see-through insulator but also conductive. That in and of itself is unusual and defies some of the more standard laws of engineering, particularly the one that states, the better a metal is at conducting electricity, the better it is at conducting heat, since both are fundamentally just energy. What is even more impressive for this particular compound is that it can be mixed with other metals such as tungsten, where they are then able to modify the temperatures at which it performs certain functions. For example, combining the vanadium dioxide with tungsten would reduce the temperature at which it became a conductor. Combining it with other metals going forward would allow for better processes to be developed, such as using its ability to reflect infrared light above 60 degrees Celsius while remaining transparent to visible light. This would allow for building design modifications. Looking back at the first described CPU argument, the fact that it performs better at transferring heat above 60 degrees centigrade means it could be extremely useful in production of CPUs. These can often operate at above 65 degrees centigrade, where they become damaged and degraded. Allowing the heat to be dissipated more effectively at that temperature range will keep them functional for longer. It would also allow them to become more powerful and prospectively even more tightly packed than they currently are. In other China and tech-related news, a Chinese-launched rocket carrying satellites has managed to drop part of its first-stage booster on a village, destroying a building and releasing toxic smoke. This is purportedly part of China's push to become a dominating force in space. Unlike other spacefaring nations, China has built most of its launch facilities inland, supposedly for security reasons. For this reason, when equipment comes back to Earth, it would normally land in the ocean, out of harm's way. In China, as is the case here, it lands on buildings and causes considerable harm, and China has a history of this occurring. While China is busy being a pain in the ass for the world, Australia is stepping up and helping a number of researchers who would otherwise be stuck in Antarctica both get home and get to the frozen southern continent. The French icebreaker called l'Astrolabe was supposed to deliver supplies and explorers to the Dumont d'Urville research station on November 15th. However, the ship's propeller was damaged. This means the ship was unable to continue on its journey. As a result, the researchers on board and those already in Antarctica were stuck in the status quo. Younger researchers were happy to stay on longer. Older researchers wanted to return home and to their families. The government has pledged to dispatch an icebreaker to see that the staff and researchers get to where they want to be. The ship should be deployed by the end of November and be well on its way by early December. This means that despite a minor hiccup that would otherwise have delayed everything for everyone, through cooperation and timely and beneficial intervention, research can continue. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.